You're in the middle of a heated argument, voices rising, accusations flying, when your opponent suddenly stops talking. Not just pausing to catch their breath, but completely withdrawing into silence, looking at you with calm, almost curious eyes. Your next words die in your throat, because suddenly you're not fighting them. You're fighting the echo of your own voice. Carl Jung discovered something profound about human conflict that most people never grasp. He realized that arguments require two participants playing complementary roles, and when one person stops playing, the entire structure collapses like a building with its foundation removed. Jung called this withdrawing the projection. In every argument, we're not just fighting the other person. We're fighting what we've projected onto them, our own shadow material that we've dressed up in their clothes. When they go silent, we're left shadow boxing with our own psyche. I witnessed this power firsthand when a colleague, Marcus, was being verbally attacked in a board meeting. The CFO was listing his failures, his incompetence, building to what seemed like an inevitable firing. Marcus sat there, completely silent, maintaining eye contact, but offering no defense. After 3 minutes of monologue meeting silence, the CFO began to falter. His accusations became questions. His certainty crumbled into justifications. By the end, he was essentially arguing with himself, eventually concluding that maybe Marcus deserved another chance. Marcus hadn't said a single word. This is what Jung understood. Arguments are psychological theaters where we act out internal conflicts. The person arguing needs resistance to maintain their momentum, like a fire needs oxygen. Remove the resistance through silence, and the fire consumes itself. Think about your last serious argument. Remember how the other person's defenses actually fueled your attack? Each justification they offered became ammunition for your next point. Their emotional reactions validated your position. But what if they had simply stopped responding? Jung observed that silence in an argument creates what he called psychological reflection. Without the other person's reactions to focus on, we're forced to hear ourselves, really hear ourselves. And often, what we hear sounds petty, cruel, or absurd without the heat of opposition to justify it. I knew a woman named Patricia whose husband would rage at her for hours about various failures and disappointments. For years, she'd defend herself, explain, cry, apologize, all of which seemed to make him angrier. Then she learned the power of what Jung called active silence. The next time he launched into a tirade, Patricia sat quietly, looked at him with genuine curiosity, as if observing an interesting phenomenon. She wasn't coldly withdrawing or passive-aggressively punishing. She was simply present without participation. Within minutes, her husband ran out of steam. Without her resistance to push against, his anger had nowhere to go. He actually ended up apologizing, not because she demanded it, but because in the silence, he could finally hear how he sounded. This technique works because of what Jung identified as the participation mystique, the unconscious identification between people in emotional exchanges. When we argue, we merge psychologically with our opponent. Their emotions trigger ours. Their energy feeds ours. Silence breaks this merger. Consider what happens in your body during an argument. Your heart races, muscles tense, breath quickens. You're in fight mode, and fight mode requires an opponent. When that opponent becomes silence, your nervous system has no target. The adrenaline has nowhere to go. Jung understood that this creates a profound discomfort that forces self-confrontation. The arguing person must either escalate to absurdity, trying to provoke response, or face the echo of their own aggression. Most people can't tolerate this mirror for long. I watched this play out in a divorce mediation, where the wife listed 20 minutes of grievances, while the husband sat silent. Not stubborn silence or punishing silence, but thoughtful, receptive silence. By the end, she was crying, saying she didn't even recognize herself, asking how they'd gotten to this point. His silence had done what no argument could. It had bypassed her defenses and let her hear her own pain without the distortion of combat. Jung would say the silence had allowed her to withdraw her projections and see the situation more clearly. But Jung distinguished between different types of silence. There's aggressive silence meant to punish, which actually escalates conflict. There's defensive silence born of fear, which invites more attack. And then there's what he called therapeutic silence, a calm, present, non-reactive witnessing. This therapeutic silence doesn't judge or withdraw. It simply refuses to engage with the level of aggression being offered. It's like offering a hand to shake when someone throws a punch. It completely changes the nature of the interaction. The power of this silence is that it forces the arguer to provide both sides of the argument. They make their point, then have to imagine your counterpoint, then argue against what they've imagined, revealing their own internal conflict. I experienced this personally when a family member attacked me over a perceived slight. Instead of defending myself, I simply said, "You might be right," and then remained quiet. They continued arguing for 5 minutes, eventually talking themselves into understanding my position better than I could have explained it. Jung noticed that silence in arguments often triggers what he called compensation, the psyche's attempt to balance itself. The person who's been attacking often swings to defending. The one who's been accusing starts excusing. The silence creates space for their unconscious to assert the opposite position. This is particularly powerful with people who argue from wounded ego. Their attack is really a defense against their own insecurity. When you don't counterattack, they have no enemy to justify their aggression, and they're left facing the real enemy, their own pain. A therapist friend demonstrated this beautifully with a client who spent sessions raging about everyone who'd wronged him. Instead of engaging or interpreting, she would simply sit in silence after his tirades. Inevitably, he'd start to soften, to question, to see his own role in his problems. Jung understood that most arguments aren't really about the surface topic. They're about power, control, validation, or old wounds. Silence refuses to engage with these hidden agendas, forcing them into the open where they lose their power. Think about online arguments, where silence is even more powerful. Someone attacks you in comments or messages, expecting engagement. Your silence leaves them shouting into the void, their aggression exposed as performance without an audience. But Jung warned that silence must come from strength, not weakness. If you're silent because you're afraid or hurt, that energy communicates itself. The powerful silence that destroys arguments comes from centeredness, from choosing not to engage rather than being unable to engage. There's a practice Jung recommended. When someone tries to argue with you, count to 10 before responding. Often, in those 10 seconds, they'll fill the silence with backtracking, explaining, or softening. They'll argue themselves out of their position without your saying a word. If they don't fill the silence, use it to really hear what they're saying beneath the aggression. What are they really asking for? What need is driving their attack? Often it's a cry for understanding disguised as a demand for agreement. The most profound aspect of Jung's insight is that silence in arguments can transform relationships. When you refuse to fight, you force a different kind of interaction. The person must either find a new way to relate to you or leave the relationship. I saw this with a couple where the husband constantly picked fights. When the wife learned to respond with loving silence, not cold withdrawal, but warm presence without engagement, he initially escalated, then broke down crying, admitting he picked fights because it was the only way he knew to feel connected. Jung believed that silence creates what he called a temenos, a sacred space where transformation can occur. In the heat of argument, no one changes their mind. But in the silence after someone has exhausted their aggression, real change becomes possible. This week, experiment with silence when someone tries to argue with you. Don't announce it. Don't make it dramatic. Simply stop engaging at the level of conflict. Listen fully, acknowledge what you hear, but don't defend or attack. Watch what happens when you refuse to play your assigned role in the argument. Notice how the other person scrambles to re-establish the familiar dynamic. Feel the power that comes from choosing response over reaction. Jung's secret isn't that silence wins arguments, it's that silence reveals the absurdity of most arguments. When you stop participating in the theatrical combat, the other person is left on stage alone, performing a one-person show that usually can't sustain itself. The ultimate power of silence in arguments is that it transforms you as much as the situation. When you can sit calmly in the face of someone's aggression without needing to defend or attack, you've achieved what Jung called individuation, psychological sovereignty that no argument can threaten. Remember, the goal isn't to weaponize silence or use it to manipulate. It's to recognize that most arguments are psychological games that require your participation to continue. When you withdraw that participation through centered silence, you don't just destroy the argument, you create space for something real to emerge. The question isn't whether you can win arguments with silence. The question is whether you can resist the ego's desperate need to engage, defend, and attack long enough to discover what happens when you simply stop playing the game.